You are listening to episode 285 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Richard Bryan McDaniel joins us to speak about the growing of Zen in the West with his books The Third Step East and Cypress Trees in the Garden. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. When I think of Zen, my mind and heart go back to the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center, the place I was introduced to Buddhism and contemplative practice. And I have this impression of long-standing tradition, of lineage, in part because of the lineage papers presented during Jukai, or lay ordination. I wasn't aware at that time that Zen in America is relatively new, perhaps less than 100 years old, or less than 4% of the entire life of Buddhism since Gautama's time. Zen has been through some amazing growth in that less than 4%. It's had its share of wins and tragedies. What's particularly interesting is how this very different culture, time, and other confluences of circumstances have changed how Zen is in this world, and how the newest generation of teachers are markedly distinct from their predecessors. Richard Bryan McDaniel was raised in Indiana, and in 1967, moved to Canada, where he taught at the University of New Brunswick and St. Thomas University before starting a career in international development and fair trade. He is the creator of the Canadian YMCA Peace Medallion. As a longtime Zen practitioner, he's the author of 5 books on the subject, including The Third Step East, Cypress Trees in the Garden, and Catholicism and Zen. Special thanks to John Negru for his work arranging today's interview. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice lemongrass tea. Our guest today is Richard Bryan McDaniel. Rick, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So very glad to have you here, and again, want to thank our friend John Negru for making the introductions on these wonderful books of yours, and you do have several of them. We'll focus on 2 and maybe introduce a third. But before we get into that, just have you tell us a bit about your background with Buddhism.
Okay, there's a story I tell on Cypress Trees. I'm driving in the car with Bowden Coley, who's the teacher at the Rochester Zen Center, Philip Kaplow's care. And it just so happened that I left my recorder on. We were just chatting as we drove to a retreat center. And he asked me, well, how did you get involved with Buddhism? And because I'm a flippant person, I said, oh, mescaline. And he goes, me too. It's probably more complex than that, but I think I was a child of my generation, and that those types of explorations with hallucinogenics, drugs, etc., made you conscious that there were different ways of seeing reality.
You were not the first person to say that. Eric Storley from Minnesota Zen Center said
Hey, look, James Ford says, after I discovered that psychedelics weren't going to save the world, but I think that was a starting point. Yoshin Radin said it's what kick-started that generation, and maybe that is true. As it so happened, I didn't link any of that experiences with Buddhism or anything. And a set of circumstances arrived that I had some insights that were not expected. And I was fairly certain they were legitimate, but I didn't have any context for them. And I was confused about why it was other people didn't see things this way. And that's when a friend of mine said, "Oh, I know what that is. What you're doing is you've had a Kensho experience on it," and gave me a copy of Alan Watts' book, The Book. And I realized, okay, yeah, there is something there that seems similar. And that, I suppose that's how I began. I've never become a formal Buddhist. I have been a Zen practitioner fairly consistently since 1971. None of the teachers that I've worked with have ever suggested I become a Buddhist, as a matter of fact. So I would look at myself as a Zen practitioner.
Thank you for that. So the two books we're going to be focusing on initially, and as I said, we'll probably be introducing third, is Third Step East and Cypress Trees in the Garden. Could you tell us a little bit about which comes first and just broadly what they...
Yeah, well, Cypress Trees comes first. It's actually, to back up a little bit, I had a contract with another publisher before John came on the scene, who wanted me to do 3 books, one on China, one on Japan, and one on North America. And then their editorial offices moved to Singapore. I suspect people in Singapore just doubted that there were any Zen masters in North America. So there was some question about whether they're going to bring out the next book or not. And it's called The Third Step East because the first 2 books are called The Zen Masters of China, The First Step East, Zen Masters of Japan, The Second Step East. And then the third book was just simply going to complete that trilogy. But as they delayed, they gave me a freedom to move publishers. John had contacted me. And so I sent it to him. And Cypress Trees was originally intended to be part of that book, but it was not quite War and Peace, but it was giving Moby Dick a run for its money for a length. So we decided, let's cut it into 2 books, be the first generation of teachers, and then the second would be the second and third generation of teachers.
So you tell the story of Zen in America, which, as you point out in the book, is shy of 100 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty new.
Little baby.
How did it first get here? Tell that story.
I think it got here by a confluence of interesting phenomena, including, among other things, the Beat Generation. I don't think it would have worked without that. There was a time at the end of the 19th century when educated people, and I'm not saying that to make them sort of inflate them, but just that people who are university educated were starting to question some of the concepts behind Christian theology. It's largely the time of the post-Darwinian time, right? So you've got Thomas Huxley and people like that who actually invented the term agnostic, saying, maybe these things that we're hearing in the Bible don't make a whole lot of sense, and maybe but there's a need for some kind of spirituality. So they're, in a way, they're looking. There's a kind of romanticism with the East that's always been there, and you had that with something like the Theosophical movement, etc. But the Buddhism that they found interesting because it seemed to them to be an agnostic tradition. It seemed to be very much a unexciting tradition because they were looking at Hinayana Buddhism, they were looking at Theravada Buddhism. They suspected that Mahayana Buddhism was kind of a corruption of an earlier pure Buddhism that didn't have all the gigas and bodhisattvas and elaborate things. So they didn't really hear much about that. And when they did, they kind of found it offensive. It was going back to the type of ritualism and worship of saints and so on that they associated with Christianity. They don't really find out about Mahayana Buddhism until the World Conference on Religions, which took place the 19, whatever the year of the Chicago World's Fair was. But it's the 4th anniversary of the arrival of the Europeans in America. And as a part of that World's Fair, some some religious leaders who were trying to revitalize Christianity, in fact, held a world parliament of religion, and they brought in representatives from world religions. First time that a Zen teacher came to North America. He came here, he spoke. There were some people who were interested in what he had to say. They said, would you stay here? Would you come and help us specifically translate some books? He said, no, but I've got a student who could do that. And that student was D.T. Suzuki. And so Suzuki came here basically as a result of that conference. And he was the right man. He could describe Zen in a way that made it attractive, that made it make sense, that made it exciting. And I think where he succeeded in particular was that he attracted the attention of people who were intellectually respectable in a way that other Asian traditions, which were already being established in North America, there were already Hindus and there were already other teachers. But he had an intellectual respectability because he got people like Carl Jung to admire his work, or the Catholic monk Thomas Merton to admire his work. So suddenly his books had a cachet that some of the other teachers didn't have. And that really begins with him. He's going to go on to become so well known that he gets his face on the cover of Time magazine. And it really starts with him. And then a few people start to read his books and they want to find out about this tradition. Almost all of them have to go to Japan to do it. There's one teacher on the West Coast, one teacher on the East Coast, but they're very, very, very small communities. You have people like the Beat Movement, people like Gary Schneider, the poet, who will actually pack up his bags and travel over to Japan. And that's where it all begins. That post-war generation who were questioning the values of American values and so on, going to Japan, where ironically the Japanese are questioning the values of their ancestors as well. And it was just that time and place, the personality of Suzuki, the fact that he attained intellectual credibility, all of those things came together, and Zen starts to make a tiny little inroad in North America.
So how did this evolve over new time in this culture? What were some of the conditions that led to that?
Okay, so one of them, of course, is that you have a social situation in North America. The writers of the Beat Movement were questioning what were considered standard American values. They recognized that a lot of these were homophobic, sexist. The American dream was really only available to a small portion of the population. These were things that this is in the 1950s, and they're questioning these things. We're still questioning them today. And they find in Zen something that's sort of what I would call a literary Zen. They find in Zen something which is spontaneous, and suggest that there's arcane wisdom. They identify it a lot with the kind of music that they like. They were fans of jazz music and improvisation, and Zen seemed to have that kind of spontaneous attitude and so on. So they become interested in Zen in a very purely almost literary sense. They would quote Zen stories to one another, and Zen stories are all have this sort of tendency to be a little zany and exciting, and it's all pretty superficial, frankly. There was a popularizer of D.T. Suzuki, I believe Alan Watts probably as well, probably better known now today than Suzuki is, who had a kind of an engaging personality, and he was interacting with a lot of these West Coast people. So he shows up as a character in one of Jack Kerouac's novels, for example. So they're all experimenting with Zen, but on a really, really superficial level. There's inevitably going to be some people who want to find out what it's really about. And those are those first people like Walter Noack, like Robert Aitken, like Gary Schneider, who go to Japan. Aitken's story is particularly interesting because he learns about Zen while he's a prisoner of war in a Japanese concentration camp. But it's something that clicks with him too. So you have those first people, and they're really a handful. I don't know, maybe half a dozen or so that get go through the training and actually achieve some kind of insight. Lots of people go into Zen training and don't get any insight at all. That's one of the things we don't talk about. So the stories are always about how this guy goes to the monastery and The teacher says, "Have you had breakfast?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm enlightened." But, there's tens of thousands of people who went there and said, "Oh no, where's lunch line?" But there were a handful of people that came back and they started communities. You had Shinryo Suzuki on San Francisco originally went there to be the teacher of an ethnic community temple. The Japanese community, they weren't interested in Zen. They just wanted somebody to light the candles and ring the bells. But suddenly after the beats, of course, come the hippies. Suddenly there are these hippies who probably had some experiences while stoned that they thought were similar to the types of issues, the types of experiences that Zen writing was about. So they would show up at the door. And it really grows out of that. It grows out of two successive youth movements, the Beat Generation and then the hippies. It grows out of a few people who bring back a teaching from Japan that is really almost counterintuitive because it's so formal, it's so rigid in its structures that the freedom-seeking hippies would actually submit themselves to this rigorous discipline, where in many cases people are beating with sticks and yelling at you and all the rest of it. But somehow out of that, and there's a lot of craziness that's going on this time, not just in Zen, but elsewhere, and people seeking. There's the Maharishi of transcendental meditation. There was Chokan Trungpa with the Shambhala movement. There were some of this was basically horse piss, but there was this kernel of people who actually had that awakening experience that Zen offers to people. There were this small kernel of people, probably a minority, that actually did have awakening experiences and realized, oh yeah, this is leading me to some kind of truth that you get intuitively, but you can't get rationally. It's a complex process. I think it's a process of a particular time. Interestingly enough, it was very much a youth movement then. It's very much not a youth movement now.
Yeah, we'll want to get to that as well. And one of the things I wanted to take a sidestep on before we do is that you share this evolution through the lens of people, of different teachers. This is not an antiseptic book. It's very much alive because it's through those stories. What was most interesting to you as you researched these books?
Well, it was kind of fun. The idea was simply to, in a way that you're talking about cypress trees. And in cypress trees, I think there's 46 interviews that I have in total in the book. I think that's what it comes out to. And sometimes they were referred to by other people. So there's certain, if you're going to try and get a sense of what is Zen like in North America, which is what cypress trees is trying to do, there are some places you have to go. What are some of the big Zen centers? Well, obviously you have to go to San Francisco, the San Francisco Zen Center. You have to go to Rochester, the Rochester Zen Center where Philip Kapleau was. So you would go to those and you do an interview, and they would say, oh, you have to interview so-and-so. I interviewed James Ford. James Ford tells me, oh, you have to interview Melissa Blacker and David Reinick, and they tell me, oh, you have to interview Josh Bartok. So it sort of spreads out like that. So to some extent, this is a group of people, all of whom are recognized within the Zen establishment as being authorized teachers. And an authorized teacher is someone who not only has had a certain level of insight, and there are different ways that that's tested in the Rinzai or the Sanbo Zen traditions. It's tested by the number of koans you passed, frankly, and the amount of time that you spend actually in supervised practice, etc. It's a little less formal in the Soto tradition, but still, these are people who have demonstrated that they have acquired insight, and what's more, have the ability to help others acquire insight. You could have somebody who has great insight but has no skill at all as being a teacher. So that's the group of people. And I think what impresses you about them is that there is, as I say, they are all people, every single one of them, that you would have been just as happy to spend an afternoon drinking beer with and talking about something other than Zen. They're just really interesting, fun individuals. On top of everything else, have this capacity, or not only have this insight, but have this capacity to share that insight with others or help other people acquire that insight. That's what struck me most about them. I enjoyed every single one of them, and they were honest. Geez, some of the things they talk about. I'm still amazed at Josh Bartok's interview when he talks about his depression. And in fact, I leave it in the book where I say, you don't have to go here if you don't want to. And he says, I didn't wake up this morning thinking I was going to talk about this, but let's go ahead. Let's continue it. They were gracious. They were I was often impertinent. I asked them about their sex lives and so on, and they were always gracious and they were honest, and they were just people that you would enjoy spending time with.
In thinking about that, this humanity, this regular old person tone of who they are pretty consistently, were there other kinds of differences between this next generation that we have today and what might have been in the earlier generation?
Well, they're facing some problems, of course. I mean, when I wrote Cypress Trees, at the time that I'm writing Cypress Trees, and it to some extent set off by the fact that Zen is suddenly making news, hard news. It's covered on CNN, and it's making hard news because of sexual scandals. Because Joshua Sasaki, I forget, he's over 100 years old at the time. Then everybody's coming out of the woodwork saying how they've been molested. There's a teacher in New York City who actually has a book written about him called The Zen Predator of the East Side.
Been interviewed on this podcast. I interviewed the author of it.
There is almost a sense of despair, a lot of sadness, but also a recognition that the situation came about by another complex set of situations, one of which is simply the difference between the way in which people coming from an Asian spiritual tradition and people coming from a Judeo-Christian spiritual tradition view these issues. And that's a real distinction. The difference between the way North Americans and Asians view these traditions, but a recognition that now has to be accommodated in North America. A recognition that, well, I mean, it's the arguments that what was it that Weinstein made? Is he said, I'm a member of an older generation. Well, tough shit. You happen to live in this generation, and that was a recognition that Zen had to come to as well. So there is a much greater awareness of the dangers of the teacher-student relationship, especially in sexual matters. There's also I think this is the most interesting thing for me, in that Zen training is supposed to cultivate two characteristics in the person who undergoes it. One is prajna, or wisdom, insight. I mean, that's the whole thing about Kensho and all the rest of it. If you've read Philip Kapleau's book, which most of these people had, it's all focused on Kensho. And in fact, the early teachers focused on Kensho almost exclusively because they felt that if they didn't have the transmission of this insight, that Zen itself would disappear. But the tradition also says it's supposed to develop karuna, or compassion, as well, so that you have the awakening, however you want to define that, however you want to think about that. And I think the big difference here with the second generation is a willingness to admit that in and of itself, that's not particularly valuable. In spite of all the emphasis placed on it by the early teachers, that this is what you've got to be working for. This is, shout moo until you're hoarse and get hit on the head, the shoulders with sticks, etc., until you get this enlightenment experience. That in and of itself, that experience has very little value unless it actually manifests itself eventually in some kind of compassionate behavior and understanding on your part. So the deepening of that experience into compassion. So now you have an interesting situation where you can go to Zen centers, and the focus of the position of the Bodhisattva Kannon, the representative of compassion, has almost a priority in some centers. The Ruben Habito Center, for example, it's a statue of actually it's a statue of Kannon, Maria Kannon, which is a combination of the Virgin Mary and Kannon. It's a particularly Japanese creation, but there's the focus in the Session Wicks place up in Colorado. The Kannon statue on the altar is significantly larger than the Buddha statue. So I think that movement, that awareness, that change, the importance of dealing with the dark side of Zen, of confronting it. I think the new emphasis being placed on compassion, and of course, the other thing, of course, is that the early teachers are all male, and now I suspect that a good, well, if not half, close to maybe more, are now female. Mm-hmm. So, and maybe that has something to do with the greater emphasis being placed on compassion. I don't draw conclusions. As I say in the book, I'm not really making any arguments. I'm just telling you what I find. I'm just chronicling. And what I'm chronicling is that you see this greater awareness of the need to take that Kensho experience and take it a little bit further, take it so that it actually manifests in something positive in your life in the way of compassionate behavior towards others.
So in light of this shift and this greater awareness of the problems, the integrity around sharing them, and the evolution that's occurring, How are you feeling about the future for Zen? Are you positive about it?
I end cypress trees by visiting two zendos in Maine. And one of them is in Portland, where Dosho Port is at that time living. He's since absconded to Nebraska. And it so happens that in the hotel that I'm staying, they're having an enlightenment expo. An enlightenment expo. They're having an enlightenment expo. My wife and I drive into the parking lot. There's this banner up there saying, Portland's largest enlightenment expo.
To distinguish it from all of the other Enlightenment expos in Portland.
Absolutely. And you go inside and there are booths and there are people. And one of the headliners reads seashells. That's her shtick. There are, meditation chairs and there are crystal gazers. And so there's something out there in a sense of hunger for people. Certainly there is, I grew up in northern Indiana and there was no interest in Zen at all. And the only thing I ever heard about, and this is the early 60s, mind you, about meditation was a warning from a pastor, Protestant pastor, that what meditation did is it quietened the mind so the devil could come in and take over your soul.
Exactly that criticism when I was on an interfaith panel discussion, and someone with a Christian radio broadcast said, no, that's where the devil comes in.
Exactly. So, and I'm not avoiding your question. I'm just trying to put it into context. There is, on the one hand, I think, a genuine desire for meaning, significance, understanding, wisdom in the world. A lot of people take advantage of that. But there's also a sense, I think, that it should be easy. That somehow it shouldn't need much effort. What Zen does is it, I think, actually does provide insight, genuine insight, but it's hard. On the long run, more people are going to go to the seashell reader than they are going to go to the Zen centers. But there will be people who go to the Zen centers. The guy I'm working with at the moment, who used to be in Portland, Maine, which was close to me and was convenient, and then he got a better offer to go to Nebraska, which is inconveniently far away from me. He works through Skype because the number of people out there who are willing to follow this route are relatively small and widely dispersed. So you will still have centers like Zen Mountain Monastery, like Rochester, like San Francisco, where there will be a lot of people. But you'll also have people in places like LaPorte, Indiana, where I grew up, or Fredericton, New Brunswick, where I now live, who are fairly isolated but can be connected through technology, etc. But they're going to be the minority. Because Zen works, it won't disappear. I think the form that it takes may be different. And I suspect that it will always be a minority choice for people. There are going to be far more people showing up at the whatever the most recent mindfulness fad is that are going to be showing up at the Zen temple. But that's all right too. One of my very favorite Zen stories, in fact, I put it on the back of my first book, is about some guy who's, when Zen's first showing up in China, he goes to a Zen teacher and says, tell me about this Buddha guy that I'm hearing about. And the teacher says, could you pass me that jar of water over there? Guy passes him the jar of water. The teacher pours him just a glass. He's drinking the water. Guy figures the teacher's old and senile, so he puts the question, the Buddha, about him. Oh, yeah, he's been dead a long time. I love that story. We're not trapped in patterns just because they're attributed to Dogen or to the Buddha or anyone else. It's an evolving tradition. The Buddha, frankly, he's been dead a long time.
So, Rick, what else would you like to share with the listeners?
One of the things that's interesting that came out of, and that's the third book in that particular series. As I said, I wrote the book largely by referral. I'd go and interview one person, he would lead me to somebody else. When it's all done, and I've got all of these interviews down in the book, and I'm looking back at it, it turns out that 3 of them are also Catholic professionals, paid clergy, nuns, monks. I don't know, monks probably don't get paid. One of them's a Trappist monk in your state of Massachusetts. He's also a Zen master. And I'm thinking, how the hell is this possible? How is it that you can, on the one hand, be a monk in a Trappist monastery? Another one's a professor of theology in New Jersey. And again, how can you be a professor of theology and all of that, and still be a teacher in a tradition which, as far as I can see, and I've been at it since 1971,
Yeah.
is an agnostic tradition by its very nature. So I became fascinated with that, and that's what led to the next book in that series, which was Catholicism and Zen. I would have liked a sexier title, but the publisher thought that would be an easy one to find on internet searches if you looked up Catholicism and Zen. And I think that's, again, one of those things that the way in which Zen manifests itself is probably going to be unpredictable. It's going to be finding roots in places that we don't expect it. I just did a reading down in Baltimore, and it was held in a Zen community that was meeting in a Unitarian church. James Ford, who's probably one of the major doyens of contemporary Zen, was also a Unitarian minister. Now, I'm not sure whether Unitarians are deists or not, or theists or not. The joke, of course, is that they address their prayers to whom it may concern. I think that we're finding that Zen will find a home in some other traditions as well. I suspect that it's important to maintain the traditional lineage lines, because I think you need to maintain the environment in which that kind of insight and awakening and development of karuna take place. The traditional Zen does that. And I'm noticing that even in these communities that I've visited that are identified as being Catholic Zen, they're also they're also becoming less dogmatic in their theology, more open to a Buddhist vision of the world. I found that that was just simply a fascinating sort of side thing that led to another book. I didn't think it was going to be another book, but it turned out to be.
Well, for those who are interested in finding out more, I do have links to all three of the books we've been talking about today on the episode page for this episode, as well as a link to Rick's blog spot. And Richard Bryan McDaniel, thanks so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. I enjoyed this.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.